The rope hung over Hacksaw Ridge like a lifeline to heaven, swaying gently in the pre-dawn stillness of Okinawa. Desmond Doss wrapped his fingers around the frayed hemp, testing its strength one more time before the day's work began. Below him, 300 feet of sheer coral cliff dropped into darkness where stretcher-bearers waited with their arms already aching from yesterday's loads. April on Okinawa meant rain that never seemed to stop, and this morning was no different. Water dripped steadily from the brim of his helmet as he checked the knots securing the rope to what remained of a blasted tree stump. The 77th Infantry Division had been holding this position for 6 days now, and every morning brought the same grim arithmetic. How many wounded could be lowered down before the Japanese mortars found their range again? "Doc, you sure about that knot?" Private Morrison asked, his voice tight with something between concern and disbelief. The boy was 19, maybe 20, with hands that still shook every time incoming shells whispered overhead. "It'll hold," Doss replied quietly, though he'd been asking himself the same question since midnight. The rope showed wear from repeated use, dark stains that might have been mud or blood or both. Each strand carried the weight of men who couldn't walk, couldn't climb, couldn't do anything but trust that this thin line between the ridge and safety wouldn't snap when they needed it most. The plateau behind them stretched maybe 200 yards across, pocked with shell holes and scattered equipment from the previous day's fighting. 14 wounded soldiers lay distributed across that cratered moonscape, some conscious enough to whisper prayers, others silent with shock or morphine. They'd been there since yesterday's failed assault, when 2 companies had pushed up the cargo nets only to walk into carefully prepared killing zones. Captain Miller approached through the morning gloom, his boots squelching in the mud that seemed to be half water, half pulverized coral. His face carried the particular exhaustion of an officer who'd been writing too many letters home to mothers he'd never meet. "Doss, headquarters wants us down from here in 30 minutes, he said, not quite meeting the medic's eyes. "Intelligence says the Japanese are massing for a counterattack." "What about them, sir?" Doss gestured toward the scattered wounded without turning around. "We'll send stretcher teams up after we soften the position with artillery." The silence that followed felt heavier than the distant rumble of guns from other sectors. Morrison shifted nervously, while Sergeant Mitchell emerged from a nearby foxhole, his rifle slung and his expression unreadable. "Begging your pardon, Captain, but artillery's what put them up here in the first place," Mitchell said carefully. "And that's a long wait for men who might not have a long wait in them." Doss finally turned around, his medical bag slung across his shoulder like some strange uniform variation. He'd modified the straps himself, distributing the weight of extra bandages, morphine syringes and tourniquets across his frame. No rifle, no ammunition, just the tools for putting people back together in a place specifically designed to tear them apart. "How long would it take, Doc?" Captain Miller asked. "To get them all down?" Doss looked back at the rope, calculating loads and time and the growing light that would make them visible to enemy observers. "Maybe 2 hours, if the rope holds. If they don't start dropping mortars on us. If I don't make any mistakes." "That's a lot of ifs," Morrison muttered. The sound of distant voices carried across the plateau, Japanese voices, calling coordinates or orders from positions dug deep into the coral caves that honeycombed the ridge. Everyone on top could hear them, a constant reminder that they were exposed, surrounded, holding ground that probably wasn't worth the cost of keeping it. "Sir, what if we compromise?" Mitchell suggested. "Take the walking wounded down with the main body, leave a small team to work the rope. We could have the worst cases down before full daylight." Captain Miller studied the brightening horizon, weighing orders against casualties against the simple mathematics of time and distance. "How small a team?" "2 men on the rope, 1 for security," Mitchell replied, then paused, though I guess security's not the right word when we're talking about Doc here. It was an old tension, one that had followed Doss through training and across the Pacific. His refusal to carry weapons had earned him everything from admiration to outright hostility, depending on who was doing the calculating. Some saw him as the bravest man in the unit, others worried that his convictions would get them all killed. "I'll stay," Doss said simply. With or without the team. Morrison stared at him. Doc, that's not bravery. That's suicide. Maybe, Doss replied, kneeling beside the nearest wounded soldier. But I didn't come up here to leave people behind. The wounded man was Corporal Jenkins, a career soldier who'd survived Leyte and Luzon, only to catch shrapnel in both legs on this godforsaken piece of coral. His eyes were closed, but Doss could see the tension in his jaw that meant consciousness and pain. How are we doing, Corporal? Doss asked softly. Been better, Doc. Jenkins managed a weak smile. Been worse too, though I can't remember when. As if summoned by their conversation, a distant thump echoed across the ridge, Japanese mortars still searching for range. The first shells impacted 100 yards east, sending up geysers of coral dust and smoke. Captain Miller checked his watch, his expression settling into the kind of resignation that comes with impossible choices. You've got until we start taking direct fire, he told Doss. Then we extract whatever team is still up here. Understood, sir. But as the captain walked away, calling for the main body to prepare for withdrawal, Morrison and Mitchell remained behind. They stood looking at the rope, at the wounded, at the man who just volunteered to lower 14 soldiers off a cliff while enemy mortars walked steadily closer. This is crazy, Doc, Morrison said finally. Probably, Doss agreed, already moving toward Corporal Jenkins with a stretcher improvised from a poncho and broken rifle stocks. But crazy's been working so far. If stories like this make you imagine what you'd do under fire, tell us in the comments how you think you'd react in this situation. And stay with us for the next chapters. The first man went down easy. Corporal Jenkins, despite his wounds, had enough strength to help position himself on the makeshift stretcher, and the rope held firm against the coral outcropping. Doss lay flat on his stomach at the cliff edge, feeding line through his burned hands, while Morrison and Mitchell created the illusion of a larger defensive force by moving between positions and firing sporadically into the tree line. From below came the soft thump and voices confirming safe arrival. Jenkins was down, conscious, already being carried toward the aid station that waited another quarter-mile back through jungle trails slick with morning rain. 1 down, 13 to go. The Japanese mortars had found a rhythm now, walking their fire back and forth across the plateau in a methodical search pattern. Each impact sent up fountains of coral dust and shattered equipment, and Doss could hear voices from the cave systems calling adjustments. They knew Americans were still on top, they just couldn't pinpoint exactly where. Next one's Private Russo, Mitchell called quietly, gesturing toward a young soldier who'd taken a bullet through the shoulder and another through his left leg. The kid was awake, but fading, his face gray with shock and blood loss. Doss hauled the rope back up, his shoulders already burning from the first evacuation. The hemp was wet now, which made it heavier but also easier to grip. He'd wrapped strips of torn undershirt around his palms, but he could feel blisters forming underneath. "How you holding up, Private?" he asked Russo as they maneuvered him onto the poncho. "Can't feel my arm, Doc," Russo whispered. "Is that bad?" "Means the morphine's working," Doss replied, though he'd seen the entry wound and knew the bullet had done more than pierce muscle. "You're going down to see the real doctors now. They'll get you fixed up proper." What he didn't say was that Russo would probably lose the arm. What he didn't say was that the shoulder wound had nicked an artery and time was running short. What he didn't say was that lowering an unconscious man off a cliff in a rainstorm was about as dangerous as anything he'd ever attempted. But Russo just nodded and closed his eyes, trusting completely in hands that were already slick with other men's blood. The second evacuation took longer. Halfway down, the stretcher snagged on a coral projection, leaving Russo suspended in space, while mortars impacted closer to their position. Doss could hear Mitchell cursing softly as he tried to provide covering fire with ammunition they couldn't afford to waste. "Cut him loose," Morrison hissed. "They're ranging in on us." But Doss was already securing a second rope around his own waist, preparing to rappel down and free the stuck stretcher. It was madness. He'd be completely exposed on the cliff face, silhouetted against the coral, unable to defend himself even if he'd been willing to carry a weapon. "Doc, don't!" Mitchell called. "We'll find another way." "No time," Doss replied, already swinging over the edge. The descent felt like hours, but couldn't have been more than minutes. Hand over hand down the wet rope, while pieces of shrapnel whistled past from the latest mortar barrage. Rousseau remained unconscious, which was probably a mercy. Being suspended over 300 feet of empty air while barely alive wasn't an experience anyone should have to remember. Doss reached the snagged stretcher just as his rope ran out. With one hand maintaining his grip and the other working to free the poncho from the coral projection, he found himself praying words his grandmother had taught him years ago. Simple requests for strength, for steady hands, for just enough time to get one more man to safety. The stretcher came free with a sudden jerk that nearly cost him his grip. Below, voices shouted encouragement and instructions, but the wind scattered their words into meaningless noise. Above, Morrison and Mitchell maintained their desperate masquerade, trying to convince hidden Japanese observers that a full squad still defended the ridge. By the time Doss climbed back to the top, his hands were bleeding through the improvised bandages. But Rousseau was down, alive, on his way to surgery that might save his life if infection didn't set in first. 2 men saved, 12 to go, and the mortars were definitely getting closer. "That was the stupidest thing I've ever seen," Morrison said, as Doss coiled the rope for the next descent. "Probably," Doss agreed, already moving toward the next casualty. Private Yamamoto, a Japanese-American soldier from the 442nd who'd been attached to their unit, lay in a shell crater about 30 yards from the cliff edge. He'd caught fragments in his back and legs, and moving him would require carrying him across open ground while mortars searched for targets. "We could wait," Mitchell suggested. "Let the barrage pass." "He doesn't have time to wait," Doss replied, studying the wounded soldier's pale face and shallow breathing. What followed was a sprint across broken ground that felt like running through a nightmare. Doss bent low, weaving between shell holes while coral chips exploded around his feet. Morrison and Mitchell provided what cover they could, but there wasn't much cover to provide against mortars that dropped out of the sky like rain. Yamamoto was conscious when Doss reached him, his eyes wide with pain and something deeper, the particular fear of a man who knew his heritage might complicate his treatment if he fell into enemy hands. "I got you, soldier," Doss whispered, checking the shrapnel wounds. "You're going home. Doc, I can't feel my legs. We'll worry about that later. Right now we just get you down." The sprint back to the cliff edge took forever and no time at all. Doss half-carried, half-dragged the wounded soldier while the world exploded around them in fountains of coral and smoke. By the time they reached the rope, all 3 men were coated in dust and breathing hard. The third evacuation went smoothly until the rope began to fray. Doss could see individual strands parting under the load, hemp fibers separating with small popping sounds that might have been gunfire or might have been their lifeline slowly disintegrating. "How many more can she take?" Mitchell asked, examining the rope. Doss tested the remaining strands, calculating weight and wear against the 9 men still waiting for evacuation. "Maybe 6 more, maybe 7 if they're light. And if she breaks, then we find another way down." But they all knew there wasn't another way down. The cliff face was sheer coral, impossible to climb without equipment they didn't have. The cargo nets and rope ladders from yesterday's assault had been destroyed or abandoned during the retreat. This single rope, already showing dangerous wear, was the only connection between the wounded on top and the medical help below. Morrison looked out across the plateau, where the remaining casualties lay scattered in whatever cover they could find. Some were unconscious, others barely hanging on. All of them depended on a piece of hemp that might not survive the next evacuation. "We need to prioritize," he said quietly. Doss looked up from where he was splicing reinforcement into the fraying section. "Prioritize how?" "Worst cases first. Men who will die if they don't get down immediately. They're all going to die if they don't get down. Doc, be realistic. If the rope breaks, the rope's not going to break, Doss said with quiet certainty. We're going to get every man off this ridge. It was a promise made in rain and gunpowder, witnessed by two exhausted soldiers who wanted to believe him, but had seen too much war to trust in miracles. Above them, clouds gathered for another downpour that would make the rope even more dangerous to use. Around them, Japanese mortars continued their methodical search for American positions. And below them, at the bottom of 300 feet of coral cliff, stretcher-bearers waited in the growing darkness for bodies that might or might not arrive alive. The fourth man down was Private Morrison. Not wounded, not unconscious, but clinging to Doss's arm, with hands that shook uncontrollably as another mortar barrage walked across the plateau. The kid had finally reached his breaking point somewhere between watching Yamamoto disappear over the cliff edge and realizing that the rope was their only way off Hacksaw Ridge. "I can't do this anymore, Doc," Morrison whispered. "I can't watch this anymore." Doss looked into the young soldier's eyes and saw something beyond fear, a kind of spiritual exhaustion that came from witnessing too much pain in too short a time. The kid had been steady under fire, helpful with the wounded, professional in every way that mattered, but everyone had limits, and Morrison had found his. "Get him down," Mitchell said quietly, "before he falls apart completely." So they rigged Morrison on the stretcher like a casualty, wrapping him in a poncho to hide his shame from the stretcher-bearers below. As Doss lowered him into the darkness, he wondered how many other soldiers were holding themselves together through pure willpower, and what would happen when that willpower finally cracked. The rope held, barely, but it held. Now it was just Doss and Mitchell on top of Hacksaw Ridge, with 10 wounded men scattered across a plateau that enemy mortars were slowly turning into a moonscape. The rain had intensified, turning the coral dust into a slippery paste that made every step treacherous. "Doc, headquarters is getting nervous," Mitchell said, holding up a field radio that crackled with static and distant voices. "They want to know our status." "What did you tell them?" "That we're proceeding with evacuation. I didn't mention that we're down to 2 able-bodied men and a rope that's held together with prayer and spite." Doss was already moving toward the next casualty. Sergeant Walsh, a career soldier who'd taken shrapnel in his chest and abdomen. Walsh was conscious but fading, his breathing shallow and labored. Blood frothed at the corners of his mouth with each exhale. "How long you been in, Sergeant?" Doss asked as he checked the wounds. 14 years come September," Walsh whispered. "If I make it to September, you'll make it. You're too mean to die on some coral pile in the middle of nowhere." Walsh managed a weak laugh that turned into a coughing fit. "Doc, if this rope breaks, it won't break. But if it does, you make sure the story gets told right. These boys didn't die for nothing. This ridge, this whole damned island, it means something." Doss nodded, though he wasn't sure what it meant beyond pain and mud and the sound of wounded men calling for help in the darkness. The strategic importance of Okinawa was obvious to generals and admirals, but up here on the ridge, strategy collapsed into something much simpler: get the wounded down alive. The 5th evacuation nearly ended in disaster. Halfway down, the rope caught fire, not literally fire, but friction heat, from the rough coral that had worn the hemp so smooth it began smoking under Walsh's weight. Doss could smell burning fiber and see tiny wisps of smoke rising from where the rope rubbed against the cliff edge. "Pull him back up!" Mitchell shouted, but there was no pulling back up. Walsh was too heavy, the rope too damaged, the cliff face too steep. The only choice was to lower him faster, accepting the risk of a rough landing rather than watching the rope burn through completely. Walsh hit the bottom hard, but alive. The voices from below confirmed safe arrival, though the stretcher-bearers would need time to organize before they could receive the next casualty. Time they didn't have. Japanese voices from the cave systems had grown more urgent, and Doss could hear the distinctive sound of equipment being moved. preparation for either a counterattack or a more systematic bombardment of American positions. "We need to speed this up," Mitchell said, examining the rope's burned section. "Any faster and we'll lose somebody. Any slower and we'll lose everybody." It was the fundamental mathematics of battlefield medicine, balancing speed against safety, individual lives against collective survival. Doss had been making these calculations since the first day he'd picked up a medical bag, but they never got easier. The radio crackled again, Captain Miller's voice cutting through static and distance. "All units be advised. Enemy counterattack expected within the hour. All forward positions prepare for withdrawal." Mitchell looked at Doss. "That's it, Doc. Orders are orders." 9 men, Doss said quietly. "What?" 9 men still on this ridge. "You want to explain to their families why we left them here?" "I want to explain to my own family why I came home alive," Mitchell replied. "And you should too." It was the first time anyone had directly challenged Doss's determination to stay with the wounded. Mitchell wasn't questioning his courage or his faith, just the simple arithmetic of survival in a place where heroism and suicide often looked exactly the same. Around them, the remaining casualties lay in whatever shelter they could find. Some were unconscious, others delirious with pain or fever. All of them depended on a burned rope and 2 exhausted soldiers who were running out of everything except stubbornness. 10 more minutes, Doss said finally. "Give me 10 more minutes. Would you follow the orders exactly, or trust what your own eyes and instincts tell you in a moment like this? Comment which path you'd take, and share this episode with someone who loves real human stories from history." The 6th man down was Corporal Anderson, who'd been unconscious since yesterday's fighting. Easy to move, light enough that the damaged rope held without protest. But as Doss lowered him into the darkness, he could hear Japanese voices getting closer, moving through the cave systems that connected their positions. 8 men left, and somewhere in the distance the sound of engines, tanks or artillery pieces being moved into position for whatever was coming next. "Doc," Mitchell said quietly, "I think this might be it." Doss looked out across the plateau, counting the scattered forms of wounded soldiers who'd trusted him to get them home alive. Then he looked at the rope, frayed and burned but still holding. Finally, he looked at Mitchell, a good soldier caught between conflicting loyalties and impossible choices. "Maybe," he replied, "but not yet." The rope snapped at 0347 hours, just as Doss was lowering Private Kowalski over the cliff edge. Not a complete break. 3 strands out of the original dozen held firm, leaving the wounded soldier suspended in space, while the remaining hemp stretched and groaned under his weight. From below came shouts of confusion and alarm as the stretcher jerked to a halt halfway down the coral face. "Pull him back up!" Mitchell yelled, but they all knew that was impossible. Kowalski weighed nearly 200 pounds, and the remaining rope strands wouldn't support that kind of lateral stress. "I'm going down," Doss said, already rigging a second line around his waist. "Doc, those strands won't hold both of you. They'll hold long enough." What followed was the longest 3 minutes of Doss's life. Hand over hand, down the cliff face in darkness and rain, with enemy mortars impacting closer and the sound of Japanese voices echoing from cave positions that seemed to surround the ridge. Kowalski was semi-conscious, moaning softly as the stretcher swayed in the wind. "Stay with me, soldier," Doss whispered as he reached the damaged rope. Almost there. The repair was brutal and improvised, splicing the broken strands back together with parachute cord and strips of canvas torn from equipment pouches. Not elegant, not safe, but functional enough to continue the descent. By the time they reached the bottom, both men were coated in coral dust and bleeding from a dozen small cuts. 7 men left on top, and now they had no rope at all. "We need another way," Mitchell said when Doss finally climbed back to the ridge. "There is no other way. And then we wait for the relief column. They'll bring proper equipment." Doss looked across the plateau where the remaining casualties lay scattered in shell holes and behind whatever cover they could find. Some were unconscious, others barely clinging to consciousness. All of them had been waiting since yesterday's assault for evacuation that might never come. "They don't have time to wait for relief," he said quietly. What Doss did next violated every principle of military doctrine and common sense. Instead of trying to find another rope or waiting for reinforcements, he began carrying the wounded to the cliff edge one by one, not to lower them down, but to prepare them for a different kind of evacuation. The cargo nets from yesterday's assault hadn't been completely destroyed. Sections of the heavy rope netting still hung from pitons, driven into the coral face, though most of the ladder had been shot away during the retreat. What remained was maybe 50 feet of climbable net, followed by a 200-foot drop to the rocks below. "That's suicide," Mitchell said flatly. "Maybe, but it's better than leaving them here." What followed was the most dangerous hour of either man's life. Using tent poles and broken rifles as splints, Doss improvised stretchers that could be strapped to a man's back. Then, moving one casualty at a time, he began the descent down what remained of the cargo net. The first trip nearly killed him. Corporal Martinez, unconscious from blood loss, strapped to Doss's back like an oversized pack. The net was slippery with rain and coral dust, and several of the rope sections had been weakened by shrapnel damage. Halfway down, one of the pitons pulled loose, leaving them swaying over empty space, while Doss scrambled for handholds. But somehow, impossibly, they made it to the bottom of the intact section. From there, it was another improvised rope descent, using climbing gear scavenged from yesterday's assault. Not safe, not recommended, but alive. The second trip was easier. Private Rodriguez, conscious enough to help with handholds and weight distribution. The third trip, Sergeant Baker, delirious with fever but light enough that the damaged net held without protest. By the fourth trip, Doss was operating on pure adrenaline and stubbornness. His hands were raw meat, his shoulders screamed with exhaustion, and his vision blurred from fatigue. But 4 men were down safely, and only 3 remained on the ridge. "Doc, you need to stop," Mitchell said as they prepared for the 5th evacuation. "You're going to kill yourself." "Probably. I'm serious." "You're shaking so hard you can barely tie knots." Doss looked down at his hands and saw that Mitchell was right. The tremor was subtle but constant, the kind of involuntary movement that came from pushing human endurance past reasonable limits. But Private First Class Johnson lay in a shell crater 40 yards away, semi-conscious and bleeding from wounds that wouldn't wait for reinforcements. 2 more trips," he said quietly. "What if the net breaks completely? Then we find another way." But they both knew there wasn't another way. The cliff face was sheer coral, impossible to free climb without equipment they didn't have. The cargo net represented their last option, and it was deteriorating with each use. Johnson's evacuation went smoothly until the final piton pulled free. Doss felt the net give way beneath his weight and managed to grab a coral projection with one hand while supporting the unconscious soldier with the other. For maybe 10 seconds, they hung suspended over 200 feet of empty air, held only by Doss's failing grip on the rough coral. Then Mitchell appeared beside them, rappelling down a line improvised from tent rope and personal equipment. Together, they managed to rig a new anchor point and complete the descent. Johnson reached the bottom alive but unconscious, his breathing shallow but steady. 2 men left, and the cargo net was finished, too damaged to support another descent. As Doss climbed back to the ridge for what would have to be the final time, he could hear tank engines in the distance. The Japanese counterattack was beginning, and when it came, anyone still on top of Hacksaw Ridge would be cut off from any hope of evacuation. "Doc," Mitchell said as they prepared for the last trip, "we can't take 2 men down together. The remaining rope won't hold that much weight." "I know. So what do we do?" Doss looked across the plateau where the final 2 casualties waited. Private Chen, conscious but paralyzed from a back injury. Corporal Williams, unconscious and barely breathing from chest wounds. Both men needed immediate medical attention. Both men deserved to go home to their families. Only one could go down on the last descent. It was the kind of choice that would stay with him for the rest of his life. Which wounded soldier gets saved, and which one gets left behind on a ridge about to be overrun by enemy forces? "We make 2 trips, he said finally. "Doc, there isn't time for 2 trips. Then we make time." The choice that haunted Desmond Doss for the rest of his life wasn't which man to save. It was realizing that he didn't have to choose at all. As he stood at the cliff edge, preparing for what everyone assumed would be the final evacuation, Doss found himself remembering something his grandfather had told him years ago about the difference between impossible and difficult. Impossible meant the laws of physics said no. Difficult just meant nobody had figured out how to say yes, yet. The remaining rope was 50 feet long, maybe 60. The cliff face dropped 300 feet to the rocks below. Simple mathematics said 1 trip, 1 man, end of story. But mathematics had never accounted for the kind of stubborn faith that had carried Doss through basic training, across the Pacific, and up the cargo nets to this godforsaken ridge. "Mitchell, how much personal rope do we have left?" "Maybe 30 feet, counting bootlaces and equipment straps." "And how much do you weigh?" "About 160. "Why?" What Doss proposed next violated every principle of climbing safety and common sense. Instead of lowering the wounded soldiers separately, he would tie them both to his own body and rappel down the cliff face, using Mitchell as a human anchor at the top. "That's insane," Mitchell said flatly. 3 men's weight on a rope that's already compromised? "It'll work." "How can you possibly know that?" "I don't know it. I believe it." The distinction mattered more than either man could have explained. Knowledge was charts and calculations and engineering specifications. Belief was something deeper, a certainty that some things were worth attempting even when success seemed impossible. They rigged Private Chen first, strapping him to Doss's back with equipment webbing and torn canvas. Chen was paralyzed from the waist down, but conscious enough to understand what was happening. "Doc, this is crazy," Chen whispered. "Probably. But crazy's been working so far." Corporal Williams was unconscious, which made him easier to secure but harder to balance. They strapped him to Doss's front, using more improvised harnesses, creating an awkward but functional configuration that distributed the weight across his frame. The total load was nearly 400 pounds, 2 wounded soldiers, plus Doss himself, suspended from a rope that had been spliced and repaired multiple times. Mitchell anchored the line around his own body, using his weight and strength to control the descent. "If this rope breaks, we all die," Mitchell said as they prepared for the descent. "If we don't try, they die anyway," Doss replied. "At least this way, they have a chance." The descent began in darkness and rain, with Japanese tank engines growing louder in the distance. Hand under hand down the cliff face, with 2 unconscious soldiers strapped to his body and Mitchell controlling their rate of fall from above. 50 feet down, the rope stretched ominously under the load. 100 feet, and individual strands began to pop with small, sharp sounds like breaking guitar strings. At 150 feet, Doss could feel the line starting to unravel completely. "Mitchell!" he called up. "How much rope left?" "Maybe 50 feet, and it's not going to last." They were still 100 feet above the rocks when the rope finally gave way. Not all at once, a gradual failure that gave Doss maybe 3 seconds to react. He twisted his body to catch a narrow ledge in the coral face, a projection barely wide enough for handholds. For several impossibly long moments, all 3 men hung from his grip on the wet coral while the severed rope whipped past them into darkness. Then, voices from below, stretcher-bearers who'd been waiting in the rain, calling coordinates and encouragement. Someone had rigged a new line from the bottom, feeding it up the cliff face to where Doss clung to the coral with bleeding hands. The final 50 feet took forever and no time at all. Down through darkness and rain, to hands that caught them, voices that confirmed safe arrival, stretchers that carried the wounded toward aid stations where real doctors waited with real equipment. Chen survived. His paralysis was permanent, but he lived to see his family again, to marry his sweetheart, to raise children who would never fully understand what their father had endured on a coral ridge in Okinawa. Williams died 3 days later in a field hospital, not from his wounds, but from pneumonia contracted during the evacuation. The medical report listed the cause of death as complications from combat injuries, but Doss always wondered if those extra hours on the ridge had made the difference. As he climbed back up the cliff for the last time, using fresh rope thrown down by the relief column that had finally arrived, Doss found Mitchell waiting at the top. The sergeant was sitting in the mud, staring out across the empty plateau where 14 wounded soldiers had spent the night. "Doc," Mitchell said quietly, "what you did up here, it's not normal." "I know. I mean, they'll probably give you a medal for it. Write it up in the citations, make it sound heroic and clean." "I know. But it wasn't heroic, was it? It was just necessary." Mitchell nodded slowly. Around them, the first elements of the relief column were setting up defensive positions, preparing for the counterattack that everyone knew was coming. Fresh soldiers with clean equipment and full ammunition loads, ready to hold ground that had cost so much to take. "The rope," Mitchell said, gesturing toward the frayed hemp that had carried 14 men to safety. "What do we do with the rope?" Doss looked at the blood-stained line that had held when everything else failed, that had carried impossible loads through impossible circumstances. Already, someone was coiling it up, preparing to add it to the pile of damaged equipment that would be salvaged or discarded. "Leave it," he said finally. "Someone else might need it." But he knew that wasn't true. The rope was finished, worn beyond any hope of repair. Like the ridge itself, like the men who'd fought for it, like the medic who'd refused to leave wounded soldiers behind, everything was changed by what had happened in the darkness between the cliff edge and the rocks below. The official citation would mention his conspicuous gallantry and devotion to duty. It would describe the evacuation in clean, heroic language that made it sound inevitable and noble. What it wouldn't mention was the tremor in his hands that lasted for months afterward, or the way the smell of wet rope would always bring back the sound of wounded men calling for help in the darkness. 40 years later, Desmond Doss woke up in his small house in Georgia to the sound of rain on the roof and the phantom smell of wet rope. The nightmares had faded over the decades, but they never disappeared completely, just retreated to the edges of sleep, waiting for triggers that could transport him back to Hacksaw Ridge in an instant. The phone call came at 7 in the morning. A young historian from the Army War College, working on a project about Medal of Honor recipients and their long-term experiences with recognition and memory. "Mr. Doss, I was wondering if you'd be willing to talk about what happened on Okinawa. Specifically, the rope evacuation from Hacksaw Ridge." Doss listened to the rain and remembered Mitchell's question about what to do with the blood-stained hemp after everyone was down safely. 40 years later, he still didn't have a complete answer. "What do you want to know?" he asked finally. "Well, the official citation says you evacuated 75 wounded soldiers, but some of the survivors I've interviewed give different numbers. I'm trying to understand what actually happened." 14 men, Doss said quietly. 14 men in one night, using a rope that should have broken after the first evacuation. The discrepancy in the numbers. "Son, have you ever tried to count scared, wounded soldiers in the dark while mortars are falling around you?" The historian paused, perhaps recognizing the edge in Doss's voice. "No, sir, I haven't." "Then you understand why the numbers don't match. What matters isn't how many men went down that rope. What matters is that every man who could be saved was saved." After he hung up, Doss sat in his kitchen drinking coffee and thinking about memory, about how stories change in the telling and retelling. The official version of Hacksaw Ridge had taken on a life of its own over the decades, growing in the retelling until it sounded like something from a movie rather than the terrified, improvised struggle he actually remembered. 75 men. The number had appeared in early newspaper accounts and stuck, despite efforts by survivors to correct the record. Somehow, 14 men evacuated in one desperate night had become 75, transforming an act of stubborn determination into something approaching the miraculous. Not that it mattered now. The men were down, the war was over, and most of the witnesses were dead or scattered across the country, carrying their own versions of that night in their private memories. The mail brought a letter from Chen's daughter, written in careful handwriting on pale blue stationery. Her father had died peacefully the week before, surrounded by family in his home in California. The funeral had been well attended, she wrote, with full military honors and a flag presentation that made everyone cry. He talked about you sometimes, the letter continued. Never the details, but he would mention the medic who wouldn't leave us behind. He said you saved more than his life that night. You saved his faith in what people could do for each other. Doss folded the letter carefully and placed it in the box where he kept such correspondence. Over the years, he'd received hundreds of similar notes from families of men he'd treated, evacuated, or simply comforted in the darkness of various Pacific battlefields. Some he remembered clearly. Others had faded into the general blur of mud and blood and frightened voices calling for help. But Chen he remembered, the paralyzed soldier strapped to his back during that final descent, conscious enough to whisper prayers as they rappelled down the cliff face with a rope that was coming apart, strand by strand. The afternoon brought visitors, a local church group, researching a presentation about faith and service. They wanted to know about the role of religion in his decision to serve as a combat medic without carrying weapons, about how his beliefs had sustained him through the worst moments of the war. People want to make it about faith, Doss told them, sitting in his living room surrounded by photo albums and military memorabilia. Like I heard some voice telling me what to do, or saw some vision that made everything clear. Wasn't it about faith? One of the visitors asked. Faith was part of it, but mostly it was just practical. There were wounded men who needed help, and I was there to help them. The theology came later, in the quiet moments when I tried to make sense of what we'd all been through. What he didn't tell them was about the morning after Hacksaw Ridge, when he'd found himself sitting in an aid station tent, staring at his bandaged hands and shaking uncontrollably. Not from fear or exhaustion, but from the delayed realization of how close they'd all come to dying on that cliff face. Mitchell had found him there, still covered in coral dust and dried blood, unable to stop the tremors that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than muscle and nerve. "Doc, you okay?" "I don't know," Doss had replied honestly. "Ask me again in 10 years. Now it was 40 years later, and he still wasn't sure about the answer. The hands had healed, the nightmares had faded, and the tremors had eventually stopped, but something fundamental had changed on Hacksaw Ridge. Some understanding about the weight of human life and the cost of carrying that weight alone. The evening news carried a brief story about renewed interest in World War II history, driven partly by movies and partly by the aging of the last generation of survivors. The reporter interviewed several veterans about their experiences and the challenges of having their stories adapted for popular entertainment. "The movies make it look clean," one old soldier said, "like war has rules and heroes and happy endings, but the truth is messier than that. The truth is scared kids trying to help each other survive until morning." Doss nodded at the television screen, recognizing the sentiment, even if he'd never met the speaker. The truth was always messier than the stories people wanted to tell about it. As night fell, he walked out to his small garden and listened to the rain that had been threatening all day. Somewhere in the distance, a train whistle echoed across the Georgia countryside, lonely and insistent. The sound reminded him, oddly, of the voices that had called up from the bottom of Hacksaw Ridge, stretcher-bearers and medics confirming safe arrival, letting him know that one more soldier had made it down alive. If this story reminded you that behind every medal there's a human being carrying memories we'll never fully see, Subscribe to the channel, tell us which country you watch from, and invite someone to revisit history with us in the next story. 14 men, one night. A rope that held when everything else failed. The rest was just details, fading slowly into the comfortable darkness of a Georgia evening, carried by the rain that drummed softly on the roof, like distant applause for acts of courage that were never meant to be witnessed or remembered, only lived through and survived.